All right, we're back. We're back. We are back from a lot of presidential output here. We have reviewed the meaning of the Beatles' Helter Skelter, which has nothing to do with racial connotations until after it is that you would have heard about the nature of it after the Charles Manson stuff and his absolutely just complete. I want to use the R word here, but I'm just going to use it as troglodytic. The insinuation that this narrative that he had construed. But then I'm also curious about how it is that 97 Democrats within former Confederate states had come together. It seems that Democrats in these states were infiltrated in 56, essentially, in the 84th United States Congress to uphold Jim Crow in formerly Confederate states, essentially showing how party lines are not necessarily always obvious to progressive policymaking. And then it's interesting that you see 97 Democrats and only 4 Republicans in the former Confederate states here in 1954 ready to do this. It's kind of like this very interesting thing. It's kind of like the Southern Manifesto and everything that segregationists were outputting kind of got into Manson, and very, very racist considerations, and like very pertinently asserted here, thinking that the 17% of the black population there and about and I guess what you mean to say there is if it's 17%, it's like 8.5% of the U.S. maybe. All of the black males would lash out violently against whites, and so to the point where a new racial divide would be created amongst whites over the idea of black rights, and so now whites would just murder each other and thin each other out to the point where now just the 8 to 17% of the black population can just finish off the whole 70% of the white population in the United States. Just fucking stupid, and it's all injected into Charles Manson potentially through suggestive elements, as we say, that were already in utilization, and we would output these things in the church committee. And ultimately, it was a psyop that seems to have been primarily about inputting this blasphemous concept into the back of racist white Americans, that the blacks would rise up just to fuck the white ladies, and if we didn't let them, then they would definitely do it, and it would be horrible. Killing the ghettos would just erupt like a fire hive, and then all the whites get into a white war, a white civil war. They kill each other off, and then the blacks go in and they finish the job. So fucking dumb. Then we also went in to essentially the mechanism of how it is that the government had handshaked, very slowly, its own loopholes into legislation over time federally to surveilling Americans, even though that we found that in the 75 church committee that we would call these things treasonous, but apparently in just 3 years after that, in 78, they already started creating a mitigation for the potential of internal surveillance collection on U.S. citizens here in house, right? They started mitigating the ability, right? And they started mitigating our rights to not seeing this with the idea that they would collect foreign intelligence and their surveillance through FISA. And then even like the NSA has been unintentionally collecting American communications. Either way, so that occurs. Then Reagan signs in a mechanism to actually perpetuate and uses what it is that was proceduralized here in FISA, essentially triggers it and lets it run, but specifically only for foreign intelligence surveillance. But they're definitely already kind of sweeping in a mechanism of doing this internally and very secretly. You think the CIA didn't do that? You're fucking insane. Um, then in 2001, the Patriot Act drops after every piece of evidence that it is that we have seems to appear that 9/11 was in fact an inside job, and primarily as a means to act as a false flag to actually launching the surveillance state as enabled by the Patriot Act of 2001. Essentially mitigating everything that it was that we found in the church committee based off of the fear that we perpetuated when we purposefully blew up our own buildings through proxies in Saudi Arabia and other interests surrounding the Arabic nations. Keep it up with me? Great. Alright, so then after that, we actually have a situation where it is that they begin to create this metadata collection for anything relevant to a terrorist or espionage investigation. Not actual evidence that they have. They don't collect evidence. They would collect any metadata or communications relevant to a terrorist or espionage investigation. Which means if the terrorist or espionage investigation is being wagered and leveraged against the entirety of the United States, of America, then they are allowed to collect all electronic metadata communications, period, completely mitigating exactly what it is that Ford was screaming at people about in 75. Potentially it was just a pageant, y'all. It could have just been a pageant where we slap the CIA director on the wrist and he burns all the evidence of everything that he did that was supposedly embarrassing and not just treasonous to the fucking people here. But then we kind of move on forward, right? And so then we see that they actually also enable themselves to, while taking and collecting metadata communications, right, from our own people directly, we can then sneak into their homes and steal tangible things that aid in a terrorism or espionage investigation. Again, not evidence. It's just anything that aids in a terrorism or espionage investigation. They could be stealing money from your home if that aids their terrorist or espionage investigation. There's all sorts of stuff. But maybe it just sets you up to feel paranoid, and then you can essentially just incriminate yourself or find yourself paranoid. Find a way to defame yourself if it's to their political chagrin, any fucking thing that they see therein. And then, 7 years later, you have the FISA Amendments Act of 2008. This looks like it's under Obama. It's not. Obama was elected in 2008, did not begin his presidency until January of 2009. This is also under the same Bush administration that enables the Patriot Act of 2001. I'm sorry, I got ahead of myself. After the Patriot Act of 2001, Bush administration goes back over to the Executive Order 12333 that Reagan inputs, right? And he essentially creates more loopholes for it, right? And essentially enables that the collection of all information for the purpose of national defense, not prohibited by other applicable laws, but then they create all the loopholes where it technically is not prohibited by all other applicable laws. Then, 4 years after that, they go ahead and add more loopholes to what Reagan did that was supposedly only for foreign intelligence, but now we have re-updated it so that now we are allowed to surveil American citizens again through the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. 4 years after, right, we amend FISA, and then we start creating an establishment of procedures for targeting non-U.S. persons overseas. Okay. The government is not allowed, it states itself, is not allowed to target a U.S. person, but the NSA reveals that it does actually unintentionally collect data from U.S. people in-house, right? So they're allowed to unintentionally collect data, just not intentionally collect data. It's further amended to establish the procedures for targeting U.S. persons overseas, immediately mitigating this idea that we're not intentionally targeting a U.S. person. Immediately mitigating that same thing that seems to say first, we're not doing that to Americans. No, we actually are doing that to Americans overseas. Surveillance of a U.S. person can be authorized without a warrant because the U.S. person is outside the country. Okay? Now, here, on top of this is insane. The FBI is allowed to send blackmail letters to Americans, essentially extorting them for billing information and subscriber info. And then the American who is extorted in this way is not allowed or prohibited from revealing the contents or the existence of the letter. Essentially coming in with like a little quiet shh, or we'll kill you, or your family, right, that kind of stuff. But it doesn't say that directly. And you would never be able or allowed to point out that it exists. Essentially, there is a secret court that was implemented in the procedures for the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act of 78, right? And that the court now operates in secrecy thereafter. It's not subject to public oversight, thusly there's no mechanism for your peers to be aware of it, and all of this is absolutely unconstitutional. It's warrantless surveillance. It's warrantless surveillance. It is not due process. It's supposed to come with a court order. So they're trying to remove the nature of what due process is. They want people to forget about it over time. They want people to think that this is allowed to happen. Numero uno. Here, this is why this is so damning for the American government, right? Because if you actually go into the 2010s global surveillance disclosures that that Edward Snowden made available to us in 2013, and we kind of make a big deal over, but then it's kind of we just pave over it because Obama's president, first black president, woo woo woo, right? We all got stars in our eyes. We're all seeing Zion about the future of the nation. Excellent, excellent, excellent. It's a bunch of feel-good stuff that we utilize to perpetuate the facts that we are, in fact, implementing this further and further and further. Essentially, is it that we can go in and immediately output. Let's say it was over in Germany. So, let me say. Germany! Okay. Bam. Okay. So, when Snowden called it out, we were determined that we were in cahoots with Germany and NATO. We would spy on Germany's citizens for them. And then we would roll up our information of German citizens and then ship it back over to the German government. So now the German government technically would not be seen monitoring their own countrymen as the sovereignty immediately presiding over them. They can get away with it a little bit better, right? And this is found, right? We are doing outsourced work for Germany, surveilling their citizens for them and selling it back to them. This is a part of the deal. This is why this is a big deal. The FISA Amendments Act of 2008. Okay? Remember, it requires the establishment of procedures for targeting non-U.S. persons overseas, like those Germans we were spying on for the German government. The government may not intentionally target a U.S. person, but the NSA has revealed that it does unintentionally collect American communications. We are, to the same amendment, allowed, right, to target U.S. persons overseas. Procedures have been established for targeting U.S. persons overseas. It doesn't say who's targeting U.S. persons overseas. In these cases, surveillance of a U.S. person can be authorized without a warrant because the U.S. person is outside of the country. So technically, this deauthorizes us from being able to surveil somebody in the country directly as the sovereign intelligence agencies that we have, right? But Germany's, or any other country in NATO, but likely Germany, has a surveillance operation where they do the same thing for us that we do for them. They surveil we so that they can get around this loophole, and they now collect all of the data with the same established procedures for targeting U.S. persons overseas. We're not doing the surveillance, we're just unintentionally collecting American communications. We're buying these roll-ups and whatever you get us, right? Don't directly define that it's American communications and stuff. So folks like Germany surveil us, and then as a proxy to our surveillance industry here, they just ship and roll that back up over to them. So we spy on Germany's people for them. Germany's people spies on our people for us. It's looking really, 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 really bad. And what my request is, at least here on my own replicable camera feed to myself, is that we start making outputs on this. And that we start doing this with routine nature, right? We start doing it, and it's an expression of our liberty. And as a people, is it that all 360 million should really want us to make outputs and make examples out of this disgusting, despicable behavior that is most certainly treasonous to we in the United States of America. And probably treasonous to a lot of other countries in NATO too, if you think about it. Shit. I guess what I'm going to go ahead and assert is that if you want a president who's going to do something about it, vote for Mike. Deuces.